Yeah, I guess presentation. Well, the second half of your presentation makes it clear that it's sort of my loss that I missed the first half. But I did read your slides. Yeah, as sort of a general comment, this sort of presentation reminds us why we have institutions like the OECD. You sort of share the academics' distance from the lobby groups, from the vested interest, and the government think tanks' interest in policy problems, and you add an international dimension. Before I jump into the content of your story and sort of the whole debate about the relation between structural labor market policies, structural unemployment, and probably equally or even more important, sort of the response to very large shocks that has become an acute issue now. On that international dimension, I was puzzled to see the US completely outside your discussion, although there are very puzzling things, especially on this area, going on in the US. We've seen the US has very different institutional structures in the labor market, much less barriers, much more flexibility, lower firing costs, higher mobility. Nevertheless, it looks like sort of European-style unemployment patterns are emerging in the US. Unemployment is very high in the US. Long-term unemployment is substantially larger than it used to be. There seem to be structural elements in the US that, yeah, if you take all your correlations seriously, we shouldn't see there.
That's a very good question, and to some extent has been a puzzle. Let me try to answer the question. I don't think there was anything particularly surprising on the upturn in unemployment during the recession. This has happened in all of the previous major recessions in the US. The US, given as you said, you characterize the labor market, a more flexible labor market, tend to see much larger increases in unemployment when the GDP goes down in a recession. This time, I think, was not much different from what we've seen in the past. What is totally new, as you pointed out, is what happened into the recovery. Because there, compared to the past, when the unemployment goes up and then goes down, the European story, which is very difficult to say because there are huge differences, is actually unemployment takes more time to go up and takes forever to go down. This time we have seen this very, very slow recovery in employment in the United States into what was, at least for some quarters, a recovery in GDP. There are a number of reasons, I think, to explain that. One is the nature of the shock. This shock in the US hit the construction sector. There was a housing boom, as we know, that locked in many of those who lost a job in the area where they were living. They could not move because they were tied to the house. They could not continue to repay the loans. It was a construction sector labor intensive, so also affected certain workers. There was high intensity of the response to the GDP shock. So there was lack of mobility, sector's characteristic of the shock. And possibly, and that's what we have seen in the US even before the crisis, demographic changes in the country that led to some extent into a reduction in the internal mobility, geographical mobility. All of that, I think, contribute to what could be considered sort of a slower recovery in. And I think the other element which is important, it's difficult to prove that, is also that yes, it was a recovery, a significant recovery, but also characterized by a huge degree of uncertainty. And if you are in a recovery which is very uncertain about where you're going over the next 6 months and 12 months, many employers are much more sort of wary about hiring aggressively.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, I just published a paper on just that, on how sort of uncertainty acts like it's given option value to waiting. Yes. But if you do compare the current recovery, even correcting for the level of uncertainty, it's still very slow. And I was wondering whether US experience give rise to some additional distinctions that might productively be made in sort of future work, also in the European comparisons. To what extent does it make a difference in the response of labor markets, aggregate unemployment to shocks, whether these are large sectoral shocks or sort of aggregate shocks? We've seen I think, many people agree in this view that the US has the large sectoral shock, that sort of was excessive employment in the construction sector. And you just have to get people out of that sector into other sectors. And that's a different sort of recovery requirement than when you're sort of like Germany, where you've across the board slow down and across the board you come back out, where it's really more a credit market issue. How do you tide over temporary periods of low income? But basically, people don't have to move all that much. I was wondering whether you have similar issues across your comparisons in Europe. Spain.
I'm not sure whether everyone can hear what's being said. Can you?
Well, we're asking whether the job market experience is colored by the nature of the shock. And I brought up the US, and you said yes, US may have had a large sectoral shock that's permanent, rather than a temporary aggregate shock that sort of will go back when the business cycle phase sort of turns normal again. Could you have the same across Europe? And yeah, you were associating, for example, the Spanish dismal labor market performances, institutional differences. On the other hand, it's also a very different type of shock. In the Netherlands, people don't need to move even if they have to call sectors. Spain, they probably do. Germany has an across-the-board decline and recovery. But Spain, it's clear that there was an inflated construction sector. Yeah, how do you turn a bricklayer into a bookkeeper? It's a different type of challenge, and that may well be. I think running bilateral correlation is sort of a risky thing if there are other factors very different within your sample. I would tend to look at your presentation more as a challenge for further research, other than some very strong evidence that these institutions are really doing the trick.
No, I mean,
Spain, Italy comparison, Spain, Italy, Greece.
To some extent, I said that in maybe the first part of the presentation, because no. That's a short. I mean, that's easy for me to say. No, but I mean, I fully agree, because I fully agree in the sense that not just because of bilateral correlation, but simply because what is behind that. Some of the countries with the biggest increase in unemployment, forget about labor market policy institution for a second, had a particular type of shocks, not in terms of GDP, the size of the decline in GDP, but rather the nature of this decline. And I think you point exactly to the differences. If you look at Spain, you don't have to go to the US, but Spain, Ireland, and again, countries like the US, Spain lost 25% of employment in construction. And this is regardless of what was the institutional setting in the labor market. In Germany, the crisis was basically felt through a collapse in export, which means that this affected large, capital-intensive firms that were exposed to foreign markets, some of which, or many of which, before the crisis, were experiencing significant labor and skill shortage. When I said that the Kurzarbeit, the short-time working scheme, only played a role, there is a big debate in Germany, but basically, according to some estimates, the reduction in working time explains about a quarter of the reduction in overall working time. The Kurzarbeit explained only a quarter of the total reduction in working time. The other 3/4 was explained by voluntary agreement at the company level, because employers, in the first place, were willing to reduce working time to keep the skilled workers. But let me now go back, because I think the point you're making about the US and how this correlation could help us, what is not necessarily all there, which I think played an important role, because as we know, in the stimulus package, the US put enormous resources, significant resources to stimulate demand, but also to support the labor market by a significant and repeated extension, for example, of the unemployment benefit system to a level that was never recorded before. We would argue that this was a good move, but let me also say, in a more critical note, that the US disinvested significantly, I would argue, since the 80s, on labor market institutions. So if you just increase the income support for the unemployed, but at the same time you cannot offer adequate and effective re-employment services, training, job search, support, and so on and so forth, you might not necessarily achieve the kind of support that altogether you might want. In the short run, it's difficult to scale up institutions which take time. I would argue again that countries that had already a good institutional setting in place were able not only to scale up the resources, but use these resources in a more effective way. Again, it's not by chance that Denmark is a country in which resources for labor market policy, including active labor market policy, increase automatically. There is no sort of discretionary decision on that.
Let me pursue that a bit further, the relation between institutional changes and sort of structural shocks. If you think there are structural shocks, which means there are going to be difficult matches. There are mismatches to the structure and supply, the structure and demand. You could consider the possibility that sort of allowing for longer search, which means what on your measures would mean less flexibility, longer unemployment protection, less pressure to go out and look for a job, but maybe we know that sort of by the end of unemployment insurance, people start looking for jobs like crazy. You see that several countries are shortening the period where they give benefits. But if there are structural mismatches, that could backfire, I would think. I don't know whether your research sort of sheds light on that. Longer periods of income protection allow you longer periods of search and may allow more efficient matches. And if if the matching difficulty has gone up, longer periods might be, in fact, in the long term, give more efficiency, better allocational efficiency, more chances that the right people end up at the right job. Shouldn't we have, instead of all this focus on, like in the southern countries, Greece, etc., on sort of harsher, sort of shorter periods of support, more pressure towards taking any job, maybe give them more time to look for better matches? Given that there is a real structural nature and sectoral reallocation need. Could institutions sort of breaking down barriers, could that backfire?
Let me try to answer this question in two ways. First, the very long, sort of never-ending discussion about the generosity, maximum duration of benefit. The point I was trying to make in the presentation is that to some extent, if you look at the evidence across the board, there are two models. One model is the Anglo-Saxon model, in which benefits are not very generous, or last for a short period of time, in which there is an implicit strong incentive for people to go back into employment as quickly as possible, even with a bad match.
Right.
On the other hand, you have the more European, again, huge difference across the board, approach in which you are more supportive, in sense more generous benefit, more longer duration of the benefit. Then the challenge is the benefit dependency. And I think what are the good news and what some of the good policy reform has been to combine that with adequate and more intensive support to try to mobilize the benefit recipients back into employment. Hopefully not back into any job, but back into a good match job. Again, what I would say is that these, at least in the good times, have shown some good results in terms of providing more tailored kind of support. Now, the crisis then comes in, and all of that is put into question. So all this activation philosophy approach that I was mentioning is still under a huge test, because this function when the labor market is dynamic, where there are many jobs available and so on. It's a different ball game when you are in a time when there's huge competition for huge jobs. But what we have said is that if you have the institution in place for this activation approach, then you can provide the training. The lock-in effect is much lower, so you can actually invest on the human capital of the unemployed. You can actually provide even, and you might be surprised, but at UCD we have strongly argued in favor of subsidized jobs as a short-term way to answer the major problem of the crisis. But if you do it within a strategy, you're not just doing it with the piecemeal approach. Again, the point I was making before is that all of that, what happened in a country like Spain is that generous benefit and no re-employment services didn't really work. Yeah. It would have been impossible to prevent the job losses. The question is that it's then difficult to do whatever you can to bring them. And there are always jobs, maybe not that many, but there are jobs.
You bring up active labor market policies. Of course, active labor market policies are everybody's dream. If you could somehow sort of make the market, improve the matching probabilities, make the market work better. In the Netherlands, we are busy breaking it all down. There is an open question. Let me just ask some questions that sort of have come up from the academic side of it, and that is that the sort of statistics you present between active labor market policies and unemployment tend to be very misleading. People argue that, to what extent do active labor markets civil servants focus on the people who would have found a job anyhow, also without those active labor market? It's a sort of the selection bias. It's very well known in the assessment of training programs. If you select people into a training program, you select smarter people into the program, and you find out at the end that they're smarter, but they were already smarter before the training. That's the sort of selection bias issue. To what extent do active labor market policy really help the longer term unemployed improving their exit rates, instead of such a short term people who are flitting in and out of labor markets and would flit in and out of labor markets without these policies also?
Another good question. It's difficult to generalize, and I think it's difficult to generalize from the very good literature which is out there. Now, Let me try. If you take the good, the solid evaluation literature, which exists in this country as well as many others, you come out of that very depressed. In the sense that there is very little evidence that the main pillars of active labor market policy make any difference, if not actually waste money. This is what, I mean, again, it's difficult to summarize the literature. There might be some programs that might be effective for young people with specific problems. You have to spend a lot of money on them, and maybe you get some long-term positive effect in terms of employment opportunities in the private sector. What I think, and for very good reasons, we don't really have much evidence. I sort of advanced this hypothesis, but I cannot prove it with the thorough, solid empirical analysis, is that some of the efforts made by a number of countries of tailoring, I mean, having intervention which comes in more and more in depth with the duration of unemployment, try to make effort to improve the quality of case managers, to identify specific problems of individuals, try to tailor for them specific intervention. In some countries, I don't want to spend much time on that, but in Australia, they have subcontracted completely all placement, training, and so on and so forth. But they have introduced extremely strict incentive, whereby you're not looking at moving people back into employment, you're looking at the stability of the job, and you are differentiating the support that the private providers receive depending on the difficulty, ex ante assess the difficulty in placing that particular individual.
You would like the reward to be tied to the previous duration of unemployment. You would like them to focus on the hard cases, not on the easy cases.
I mean, again, there is a significant literature suggesting that this very tailored and complicated, complex system has worked pretty well. Of course, Australia did not really get the hard test that a number of European countries are facing, because they went through the shocks and the Great Recession much better than others. But I think some evidence there is emerging. And I think what a number of countries, even within Europe, are doing is to introduce within the public employment service similar way to evaluate and to reward a certain approaches which tend to be more well-designed to individuals. The problem is that we know nothing about how programs work in recession compared to good times. There, I think most of the evaluation we have is looking at labor market programs at a time when a number of people can find a job more or less by themselves. We know very little about how training program, for example, could help improving the human capital of certain low-skilled individual in bad time. They won't go back into employment any quicker, but maybe when they eventually get into a job, it might be a better match. This is speculation more than evidence, but I think this is a research question that I think maybe these guys will, over time,
I guess now you would be particularly interested in the extent to which training programs help sectoral reallocation. Can we turn the bricklayer into a bookkeeper? Now let me ask you other questions on another feature that you highlighted. I was intrigued by the slides you gave on the translation of short-term into long-term jobs. Maybe you can comment a bit more on that. I mean, we introduced part-time unemployment, which is sort of a variant on shorter working hours with income support from the state in 2009, with the idea that, well, we don't know how long this crisis lasts. Maybe it doesn't last very long, and then you sort of keep them in labor market habits, and you keep ties between companies and workers. You don't lose firm-specific capital and all that. Then when Greece exploded and the whole thing turned out to be a long drawn-out affair, the view is taking place that this isn't really going to help. It's not a short-term tiding over anymore. Now they simply have to downsize. And is it then just a way of raising labor costs rather than helping people maintain valuable ties to companies? Well, what's your view on the applicability of short-term working hours, let's say now that we know that Europe is in for the long haul, versus maybe 2-3 years ago when we really didn't know whether this was short or long-lived?
Again, and you know that very well, if you look at the evaluation, the serious evaluation of short-time working schemes, this would be one of those elements in which you get out of that by saying, forget about it. Because again, there is not much evidence, because these schemes were not used, apart from a few countries, to a large extent in the recent time. Belgium had significant people on the short-time working scheme even before the crisis. Italy used the Cassa Integrazione with very poor results for many years. So if you were to ask us in 2009, should we use short-time working schemes? I would have looked at the evidence, I would say, forget about it, maybe not a good idea. And I would have been wrong, I would say.
Yeah, we did.
Because I think in some countries where there was a history, where this institution was there, was not used, but was there, was known by many companies, and given the nature of the shock in Germany, I would argue that provided some help, because this was the time in which, again, companies that were facing labor and skill shortage before were facing a collapse in demand. Some of them have difficulty in accessing credit, and they were possibly constrained to dismiss more workers, even though they might would have had to recruit them again going forward. As I said, it's difficult to judge on the German system simply because companies were already doing part of that. They exploit as much as they could the bank hours. So in Germany, you can accumulate extra hours that then can be used in bad times to reduce working time. And they had a lot of bilateral agreements in which companies and the worker council were deciding to reduce working time and reduce pay within the company. We should avoid any sort of generalization. Yeah. In the sense, if you were to use the short-time working schemes in Spain, and I think I said that, I don't think it would have worked at all.
Well, the question is whether it may delay adjustment. If you really think that there's a need for sectoral reallocation, this isn't going to help because you tie people to the old sector.
But I give you one counter-example, which is Italy. Again, this would have some of the conditions that should make the system work, in the sense that the system was there, has been there since the 70s. The shock was not a collapse of the housing price bubble, was more an external-driven shock. So all things that could have made the system work relatively better. It worked in the very short run, but the problem is that it was continued, and the number of workers involved has continued to increase over time. So it moved from being a very short-term kind of quick fix or response into something which is actually delaying dramatically the necessary restructuring that would have to take place in the country. Because de facto, a number of those involved in this short-time working scheme is not just reduction of working time, they're working 0 hours.
Yeah.
So this is this guy's unemployment rather than anything else.
Shifting part of the unemployment benefits to the employer. Although actually that's also what we're going to do here in the Netherlands, with the idea that that sort of incentivates employers to help their fired employees look for jobs. The other thing that I found sort of disturbing from your statistics is the incidence of the sort of very different incidence across age groups and across skill groups of the current recession. You show a very large incidence on an increase in youth unemployment, very substantial burden of unemployment falling on the lower skilled, which is sort of, I guess, in temporary downturns you would expect that. There's less firm-specific human capital in low-skilled people, so you throw them out more easily, you get them back more easily. But for longer recessions, I think it's surprising, because then you would more expect that you sort of reduce employment across the board, since you're in for the long haul. Maybe more disturbing even than that is there's a very large shift from fixed to flexible contracts. Is that, in your view, a harbinger of higher unemployment to come? Are these flex contracts sort of a halfway house? Well, maybe we get an upturn and we get them back. No, we don't get an upturn, now we cut them. What's your view on future unemployment, given these sort of compositional differences?
I mean, two things there. One, I think we go back to the point we raised before, is the nature of the shock in different countries. Perhaps it's not surprising that job losses were concentrated, in particular on the low skills, in countries where the shock hit the construction sector very badly. Because we know that this is a labor-intensive, low-skilled sector, and therefore you got high job losses there. But I think much more than that. The other point which I mentioned, but there's a very good opportunity to go back to this point, which in my view is essential. In Spain, up to the mid of 2009, all, or at least 90% of all job losses were among those on temporary contracts. You mind, they have a third of the workforce on temporary contracts, so there was a big room for maneuver there. In Italy and in France, I say all, job losses were among those on temporary contracts. Permanent employee remains stable. Which in my view goes to the point I said in my introduction. This sort of flexibility at the margin Yes, maybe may have contributed to allow firms to adjust more quickly. Yes, maybe allowed for some increase in employment, but certainly expose all of those involved into precarious jobs, many of which don't really have, they're not stepping stone, they're not sort of stepping to better opportunities later on. Depends on the country again, much wider. But certainly expose them to shocks. So if you are a company, you're facing a collapse in demand, the first thing you do is basically to reduce, you not renew simply a temporary contracts. It's not costly. And before you get into possibly dismissing more permanent contract, you try to use as much as you can this other dimension. But this also has the point you mentioned about the recovery. Well, and you mentioned that in your question. I mean, if you are in a very uncertain environment, even if your business is doing okay, you see the demand going up and so on, well, before you start hiring people on a more permanent basis, you actually increase employment on a temporary basis. That's why we have seen huge collapse in employment, in fixed-term contract employment, and then some pickup in those countries which are doing relatively well. This is not the case in Spain, it's not the case in Portugal, it's not the case in Italy, because there is very little job creation altogether. But if there is any, at least a gross job creation, this is in this kind of atypical, less stable kind of jobs. And the reason is because these jobs, this contract are there, and on the other hand, also because this, again, the kind of investment the employer is making is different. But this is not good for, I would argue, for the economy as a whole. It's not good for the employment as well.
Years ago, in one of your employment outlooks, or your institution's employment outlooks, it's really quite a long time ago, I saw a study relating firing costs to firm-specific capital in workers and productivity. I don't know whether that research has been updated, but what does that research have for implication on this increasing presence of flex workers? And what does that mean for our future productivity? Are we actually trading flexibility for productivity?
Well, I mean, much of the literature on that in the past look at regulation of the labor market, including the regulation for hiring and firing, for employment and unemployment. And I think this was not a very good idea, because even from a more theoretical model, what you should expect is that if you make more costly to dismiss a worker, this could potentially affect the reallocation of the labor market, the hiring and dismissals of workers, the mobility of workers across firms, sectors, and so on and so forth. Some of the most recent literature that has used microdata across sectors, across countries, and so on and so forth, finds some convincing evidence that indeed what you find is that if you make it very costly to dismiss workers, you have less mobility. But this is also misleading to a point, because what happened in many countries is that they have created different types of contracts. And actually, in many countries where regulation for open-ended contract are pretty strong and rigid and protective, if you like, there are these other type of contracts which are very flexible. And then there has been some recent work looking at, well, is this a good way to increase the flexibility in the labor market conducive to productivity? And the answer is no. And that's, I think, what I said in my introduction, for a number of reasons. Because you have more churning, and indeed in Spain there is a huge amount of churning. If you look at job creation, job destruction, worker moving into jobs and leaving jobs, it's much higher or is similar to what you find in countries like the US. But the problem is this is not associated with the reallocation of labor to better jobs. It's more people churning into similar type of jobs, the same jobs, with some unemployment in the middle. And the other thing in which the evidence, I'm afraid, is less widespread, is that we know very well that those involved in this temporary contract receive less training, on-the-job training.
Well, that's the point I was referring to.
So, and if there's any relationship between on-the-job training and productivity, well, this may be a missed opportunity as well.
Let me wrap up, since I'm getting strong signals that I should move off the stage.
We should.
By focusing on two more segments of the labor markets. In the Netherlands, there is an increasing concern about the labor market for elderly, for 55, 65 cohorts, partially because firing costs are highest for them. We accumulate protection with age. It's highly correlated with age. It's much more expensive to fire an older worker. But also because we're, like many other countries, we're in the process of raising retirement age. Of course, if you raise retirement age from 65 to 67, all you do is change the label of the benefit they get, rather than getting them into work. That isn't going to help us much. would you argue there is a reason for specific focus on re-employment for older workers? Does that have different requirements, different training requirements? Is there a particular need for them given the whole pension issue?
Well, the answer is, to some extent, is yes. I mean, if you believe that the more you try to design re-employment programs to the needs of the individual, the more likely it is that you might get something out of it, the answer is yes. But I think the big challenge is, this is not just in the Netherlands, I think is in most of the OECD countries in which early retirement schemes have been eliminated to a large extent, in which retirement age has been increased. I think there's been a lot of work on the supply side, reducing incentive or possibility for people to move on to retirement before a certain age.
Yeah.
But I think we have done much less work on the demand side. What it is that is needed in order to maintain the employability of the elderly, and what is that the policies can do in order to create incentive for say, firm to provide training. I mean, again, there is a clear evidence across the board that training is given to the high skill, as you said already, and also to the younger, because it's an investment that will last longer potentially. Right. There is clear evidence that the incidence of training declines almost linearly with age. Yeah. And of course, despite all the rhetorics that the Commission elsewhere about lifelong learning, I think we know very little about what that means.
It hasn't really taken off, no. Well, the big uncertainty hanging over the Dutch debate now is we want to reduce firing costs. I think that the tendency is to believe that the sort of the hiring tax that it implies is now really hurting. On the other hand, we're worried that there will be this whole armies of unemployed 55-plussers who will basically be thrown out and have zero chance of re-employment. And that's sort of the thing that's sort of paralyzing the Dutch debate. Mm. But maybe I'm getting also signals that I'm monopolizing the discussion a little bit too much. So maybe we should open up the discussion to the floor. And if you want to ask Mr. Scarpetta burning questions, go ahead. Yeah.
So I was wondering what your advice would be to the new Dutch government that's being formed.
Could you? I missed the question.
Can you repeat the question?
The advice I would give, I think I refrain to give you a full answer to that. First of all, I would like to see what is the program, what is the government, the new coalition government will put in place, will put forward, at least in the labour market social policy area. And then, as we have done at OECD, as we do generally at OECD, whenever there is an interest on the government, we produce our annual reviews every 18 months and so on. But more and more countries, government are willing, asking the OECD, okay, this is our program, that's what we are planning to do, what do you think about it? At that point, I think I will be able to say more about what we think about. But first I want to see what concretely is planned. I think, again, the issue is one that we have just discussed, is how to somewhat reform the labor market for the elderly in a context in which retirement age has been increased. There is a strong pressure to reform some element in terms also the job protection for the elderly. On the other hand, what's happening on the demand side? And I think that seems to be an important ingredient that should be put into the picture.
We really don't know what's going to happen because the VVD tends to go for generic labor market measures such as cuts firing costs across the board, reduce employment, duration of employment benefits, which is not focused on groups, while the social democrats sort of go slow on that, but do want to focus on the elderly in the 55-65 segment. So we've no idea how that will work out. It can still go either way, and we don't know what will be presented to you at the next annual exam, which I also had to submit to when I was a civil servant. Okay. Other questions?
Wiener.
The first, that's what you showed essentially with the short-term work that came from and that was agreed that when it started in 2008. I'm sorry, Farm. So maybe it's too early to really establish now what the effects of institutions are, because I think an important missing element in your story, and which may also be relevant to the European-American difference, is the behavior of companies. So they might have really been very shocked when it started in the real economy, that is in Europe, maybe more than in the US. And I noticed that your graph saying recovery, where there was this rise again, particularly in temporary employment, ended more than a year ago. So when we are now confronted with prolonged problems, I think that companies might think actually very differently about the future and about retaining personnel, which they did and which they could do because they had so much fat on the bones because of the preceding period. And they have much less now, and they have these very negative or much more negative expectations. So when you would ask me the question, what will happen to unemployment, or particularly to employment, I think the next stage is for the permanent contracts. They will suffer, they will go down, and then we have a much bigger problem than we have even now. Is that an expectation that you would share? And what could we do against it? Do we need to stimulate the economy to prevent this?
On the first part of your question, on the learning. Indeed, much of what I show you about the resilience, when I talk about the resilience, was drawing on the data up to the point, up to the crisis. So by no means this was sort of any analysis of how labor market, how policy and institution were affecting the resilience in this economic crisis. It was drawing from the data from the previous 2 decades. So your point is absolutely well taken. There will be a lot of work to be done by labor economists and social scientists to analyze how the labor market has been responding during this major shock. Because the last time we had a major recession like the one we have been experiencing recently was not even in the 90s. You have to go back to maybe to the second oil shock in terms of the size and characteristics of this shock. So there's a lot to be done in order to say. I think what has been, even in the slides I show you about the policy institution, which has been dismissed in previous analytical work, was what is perhaps more difficult to characterize is the role of voluntary or somewhat driven by collective bargaining, negotiation, discussion among employers and worker representatives. What we have seen in a number of countries, it's a lot of proactive responses, actions taken at the company level, which I think is interesting. Our data simply do not characterize well the complexity of this relationship and how they've evolved over time. Now, I think the second part of your question is also extremely important. Is this a recovery or not? Well, as you know, a number of European countries are back in recession, and they've been in recession already for a few quarters. So the problem is that there was a sort of recovery, and then it was very weak, and then we are moving back into a recession. And this is basically unknown, because again, if you look at the major shocks we have seen, the first, second oil shock, the 90s and so on, you never had a significant second blip, which hopefully might not even be a second blip, it might be a long one. And this, of course, challenges our assessment, our projections about what is going to happen, because we are living in many countries, of course, the Netherlands is much better than many other European countries, but I mean, we are all affected through the international market in a huge degree of uncertainty. And this, I think, is affecting the investment decision of many companies, even those companies that have a clear prospect for expansion. And of course, it is affecting their decision to hiring workers. Maybe the short run has been to hire more temporary workers, just to respond to possible improvement in demand, but this cannot go further. And if the recession prolongs, then of course you would have some of those hired on temporary contract going back into unemployment. The point you say about shift from temporary to permanent, this is exactly what happened in Spain or in Italy and elsewhere. Once company had reduced dramatically the number of temporary workers, they move on to permanent workers. In Italy, they moved them into the cassa integrazione, the short-time working schemes. In Spain, they laid them off. So then you see the permanent employment declining as well. And again, we have to be very careful, because the kind of structural reforms that this country, the program country, put in place, I think potentially, if you believe it, could, as part of a package of structural reforms that makes the business environment better, may improve the incentive for employers to invest and so on and so forth. But in the short run, they are contributing to the uncertainty on the worker side. And therefore, how this play, and also, I mean, the point I make, none of them, I mean, at least the major element, are not grandfathered. So, I mean, are not going to affect the current workers to a large extent. It will only affect the new contracts. But if I know that the environment is uncertain and so on and so forth, and I, you know, how important role they will play.
All the changes in firing costs only apply to new contracts.
Yes, there is no grandfathering.
In the sense, the entitlements are grandfathered. The old entitlements persist in the new regime.
Well, let me give you just one anecdote. The best example is Portugal. They've made a significant reduction in severance payment. But of course, only for the new contract. Since the average tenure is at least 10 years, It will take 10 years before this would have potential effect. Of course, this will affect the newcomers, the new contract. But I think it's more how this will be perceived as an effort to improve the business environment altogether than the actual cost. And again, the point is also what goes with that. And there's been little reforms on all the labor market policies that we think are important to mobilize, to help the unemployed back into work. There's been less action. I think this is where the big challenge will come. Of course, when you have to cut your deficit dramatically, you have no money, so you cannot promise anything. But I mean, this is a major problem.